It's been a minute since we've covered Homebrew on the Nintendo Switch. The last update was back in October of 2018 as we talked about how 3D acceleration was available and things were moving full steam ahead. We saw some ports of Doom 3, Quake 1 and 2, all utilising the new OpenGL renderer. We also saw the early beginnings of Nintendo 64 emulation. While promising, ran pretty slow due to the lack of any type of dynamic recompilation. There was also a media player, Player NX, that started to take form too, but needed quite a bit of polish, and this was more of a proof of concept. RetroArch had improved significantly as well, with a focus on PlayStation 1, with many games being compatible and very much playable. There was also a selection of many games that could not achieve full frame rates. So what has actually occurred since October of 2018 till now? The answer is quite a lot. So we're at the end of January 2019, and since the last update that I did back in October of 2018, there's been some significant advancements in the homebrew scene for the Nintendo Switch. And the first thing that we're going to take a look at is overclocking. Now before I start, standard disclaimer, if you aren't comfortable with this, do not overclock your Nintendo Switch. It may, and I stress may, lead to an increase in heat or a reduction in battery life. I've been experimenting with moderate overclocking for the past few months with no issues at all, but once again, if you aren't comfortable doing this, then you should probably skip this part. Now with that all said, if you aren't familiar with what overclocking is, a clock cycle is a measure of the amount of time it might take to loop through one complete cycle of a clock. The number of cycles per second make up the speed of a computer processor. Modern CPUs are fast, and the Nintendo Switch comes stock with a 1 GHz CPU, therefore it can perform approximately 1 billion cycles per second. Overclocking simply means to increase the number of cycles by a certain amount. To be completely honest, the Switch's CPU isn't very fast if we compare it to similar products. It's clear that Nintendo has underclocked the CPU in order to maintain hours of battery life. If we compare the CPU to the Nvidia Shield TV, which has the exact same processor, it's almost half the speed of the Shield TV. libnx homebrew development libraries allow the developer to apply an overclock, or even an underclock for that matter, up to a maximum speed of 2.1 GHz, which essentially doubles the speed of the Nintendo Switch. But at what cost? Overclocking means potential heat issues and reduced battery life. So let's take a look at some examples. In the last update, we talked about Doom 3. While very impressive, it had significant frame rate issues. If we apply an overclock of 1.5 GHz, however, we can see the increase in the frame rates on the right hand side. In Doom 3, this isn't a magic bullet that locks the frame rate at 60 FPS, but we certainly hit 60 FPS way more than normal. And until there's additional optimizations, a moderate 1.5 GHz overclock on the Switch is a great way to experience Doom 3 for those returning to the game or wanting to try it out for the first time. It's also important to understand that overclocking is applied at the application level. So in other words, if the homebrew has overclocking code applied to it, it will utilize it, but as soon as you quit the program, it will default back to the stock clock speed. Next up is RetroArch. It's had some significant updates that I'm going to cover. There's a comprehensive overclocking menu that you can apply on the fly to try different things out. RetroArch allows you to overclock up to 1.78 GHz, and interestingly enough, even allows you to underclock to presumably retain additional battery life while playing RetroArch. I'm going to test out the boost performance mode, which is 1.2 GHz, and the high performance is 1.5 GHz of overclocking. PlayStation 1 emulation ran pretty well for the most part, but at stock clocks, there are many games that don't run at full frame rates. One example is Soul Blade, which drops to 45 to 49 FPS during the game. This makes the sound very choppy. Applying a 1.2 GHz, or the boost performance setting as it's known, almost gets us there, but the high performance or 1.5 GHz overclock locks us at 60 FPS. This is also true for Tekken 3, another game that's notorious for slowing down at stock clocks. So my takeaways from using an overclocked Nintendo Switch: I've used RetroArch for the last 2 months or so with 1.5 GHz overclock, and I haven't noticed any excessive heat or any significant reduction in battery life. So for me, I would say a 1.5 GHz overclock is perfectly safe to use if you are interested in doing this. I would say that anything higher than that is really starting to enter the kind of the red line area where there's significant potential risks that may be involved with overclocking that high. Have you ever thought about playing Half-Life on your Nintendo Switch? Well, now you can with the port of Zash 3D, which is an open source re-implementation of the Gold Source engine by Valve. What this simply means is it allows us to run Half-Life on the Nintendo Switch, which is absolutely amazing. This is the game that started it all, and well worth a playthrough if you've never experienced it before, and it runs great on the Switch in both handheld and docked mode. It does not support overclocking as it's not really needed. As you can see from the captures, it maintains excellent frame rates. The expansions Opposing Forces and Blue Shift are also supported, and I believe people are even working to get multiplayer and Counter-Strike 1.6 up and running. Imagine that running on the Nintendo Switch in portable mode. This Half-Life port, however, is not perfect. There's some lengthy load times and occasionally it will crash, but saving regularly means you can play through the game just fine. Staying on the open source engine re-implementation path for a moment longer, next up is OpenLara, which is the open source Tomb Raider engine for the early Tomb Raider series of games by Core Design. Using assets from the original PC or PlayStation versions means that you can run this on your Homebrew enabled Switch just fine. Just like Half-Life, this runs very well with excellent frame rates, and overall a very fine port and addition to the ever-growing library of Homebrew for the Nintendo Switch. So the elephant in the room in the last video was Nintendo 64 emulation. I'm happy to report that the N64 emulator has been significantly improved since the last video. We now have a dynamic recompiler that really provides full speed N64 emulation for most games running under the Nintendo Switch. This is the one that most people have been waiting on. The dynamic recompiler for ARM64 has been completed, which allows for full-speed Nintendo 64 emulation via Mupen64 running under RetroArch, and it's magnificent on the Nintendo Switch. This is important because before the Dynarec was released, it used a combination of the interpreted mode and overclocking in RetroArch, which worked pretty well, but would be considered more of a stopgap measure while waiting for the completion of the Dynarec. So anyway, it's all here and it runs very well. Check out a couple of samples. There's also been significant advancements in a media player for the Switch. A new player known as PP Play has been released that supports most popular video formats, supports subtitles, as well as HTTP streaming. It's simple and easy to use and works very well with all the things I've tested it with so far. Now, one thing I do want to mention that's not specific to Homebrew is the flip grip. Now, this particular device allows you to mount your Nintendo Switch display vertically, and you know what I'm going to say, guys, with something like MAME NX, you can play all those classic vertical shoot 'em up games on your Nintendo Switch in a vertical capacity, which is the way that they were meant to be played in the first place. So this is a really awesome piece of hardware. I am not affiliated by this company. They didn't send it to me for review or anything like that. I purchased this myself, but I will leave a link in the description below if you are interested in picking one of these things up, and if you do like playing arcade games on your Nintendo Switch, this is a must own. And to finish up, the computer that I grew up with, the Commodore Amiga, is running on the Nintendo Switch via the excellent UAE for All 2 emulator. Ported from the PS Vita version, the Switch version runs this emulator very well and supports things like an on-screen keyboard. It's great to see the Commodore Amiga running on the Switch, and fans of the system can take it anywhere with them. This is one emulator that I've already invested a lot of hours into. So in conclusion, if you don't have a Homebrew enabled Nintendo Switch, what are you guys waiting for? As we've seen since the last update, there's been significant enhancements to this particular scene and there's more to come. I'm going to do a follow-up video in a few months from now and just continue to update you guys on what's going on in the world of Homebrew for the Nintendo Switch, as well as release my own stuff. So I've got a couple of things that I'm planning on releasing myself, so stay tuned for those as well. So it's going to be a really awesome time this year for the Nintendo Switch Homebrew, so get on board if you're interested in doing so. Now is the time to get on board. Well guys, I'm going to leave it here for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions about this video, please leave a comment below. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Bye for now.